Thanks, Justin. A young stranger to the Alps was climbing his first mountain in that majestic mountain range. And even though he was new to the whole affair, he was surrounded by two stalwart guides, two guides who knew everything there was to know, who had climbed these mountains countless times, and so he felt secure climbing this mountain for the very first time. And he had one of these guides in front and one marching behind him. But the guide who was in front wanted him to be the first to see the view from the summit. And so what he did was he stepped aside and he allowed the newcomer to climb up out of that snow onto the rocks that protrude out onto the very peak of the mountain. He allowed him to go up first. But this newcomer to climbing, he forgot about some of his instructions. And he forgot that on the peak, the gales and the winds pass through so furiously with such intensity that it's not very safe to stand while you're on these mountains. And so what happened was he had forgotten about this instruction and he leapt to his feet in excitement and started to climb up to the very heights of this mountain when one of the guides grabbed him and yanked him down to the ground and said, "On your knees, sir, on your knees. It's only safe up here on your knees." There are some places in our world, there are some moments in our life, there are some jobs we might take where it's only safe if we're approaching on our knees. In other words, we'd better be humble or things might just blow up in our face. And I think a mountain is a great example of this. Any place where nature is actively trying to kill you, you should be humble. A lot of you, some of you who know me very well make fun of my fear of the ocean. What you call fear, I call a healthy respect. Because I know human beings don't belong in the ocean. And I have a healthy humility with regards to the waters out there. And I think you have to have a healthy humility if you're going to go into environments like that. For the people who explored the outer reaches of space or down to the depths of the ocean, you have to have a baseline humility or things might blow up in your face. In some cases, literally. But there are other places you might need to be humble. I think anyone who takes on a job where they face life and death scenarios, or where lives might be in their own hands, I think they'd better be humble if they're going to take on such a job, such a position where they're going to be charging into life and death. If you're going to be going into such environments where things are dangerous, then you'd better be humble enough to listen to instruction during boot camp. In fact, I think a lot of things about boot camp, and I'm talking about boot camp for the police or firefighters or the military, or you could kind of fill that in for any such job where your life is in danger. I think one of the jobs of boot camp is to humble people, because they need to realize that things are only safe if you're on your knees. You're only safe if you're humble enough to listen to instruction. I think another good example is that if you're ever going to take on the awesome task of teaching someone the Bible, you'd better be humble. You'd better be on your knees, because you don't know everything. You can't know everything. And therefore, logic dictates that you might be wrong on something. And so we all have to be very careful. I know as a preacher, when you're getting up to preach a sermon, you'd better be humble. Because, especially for someone my age, I know that I'm preaching to more than one person who has been studying the Bible for longer than I've been alive. So I'd better be humble. I better not think I've got it all figured out. And for anyone who's going to teach the Bible, we know as it says in the book of James, chapter 3 and verse 1, that teachers will incur a stricter judgment. There's perhaps for me, there's not a more humbling verse in all the Bible. We need to be humble. We need to be on our knees. And I would say another good example is any kind of leadership position, whether it be big or small. If you're going to lead a nation, or you're going to lead a company, or if you're going to lead a church, you need to be humble. It's only safe on your knees. And I think this is the point that Peter is making in 1 Peter chapter 5. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 1. If you don't have a physical Bible, you can pull it up on your phone. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 7. And what's happened throughout this letter is that Peter has made the point, and he's reemphasized it over and over again, that the people are going to endure suffering, and they've already been enduring suffering. And he wants them to endure suffering humbly. He wants them to endure suffering in such a manner that they will show those who are persecuting them the love of Christ. He wants them to suffer for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons, and he wants them to be showing love even to their persecutors. And it's after he's made this point and he's really emphasized it and he's shown Jesus as the perfect example of this. We know Jesus suffered. Jesus suffered in such a manner that he showed love and grace even to those who were nailing him to the cross. After Peter has made this point and he's shown Jesus to be the perfect example of this, in chapter 5, there seems to be a little bit of a shift where he's turning to deal with at least matters of a little bit more specificity. We don't know exactly what was going on in the different churches he was writing to. A lot of times when you read letters from Scripture, it's like listening to one side of a phone conversation, where we kind of get the gist of what might be going on, but we don't know exactly. We can't necessarily pinpoint exactly what might have been happening. And we know that Peter was writing to several different churches, so they might have been dealing with several different issues. But it seems to be he needed to deal with leadership dynamics and the relationships within the church. And so in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 4, he starts talking to elders. He starts talking to the pastors, to those who are shepherding the flock. And this is what he says to them. Verse 1. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So Peter, he gives these exhortations, this charge to the elderships that he's writing to. And I think it's good for us to break this down a little bit. He starts off in verse 1 by giving his credentials, so to speak. Now, he's already at the very beginning of the letter talked about his credentials in the fact that he is an apostle, and that gives him the authority to speak on these matters. But it seems he's also leveling with them a little bit by saying, I too am an elder. I'm speaking from experience. I'm speaking from a wisdom that comes through doing. He says, I'm right there with you. I too am an elder, so let me talk to you as an elder. And then he says, I'm also a witness of the sufferings of Jesus. Now that could mean that he is once again asserting his authority as an apostle. In other words, he's saying, I was there when Jesus went through all of these sufferings that I've been writing about. I was there, I witnessed it. That gives him some authority in what he's about to say. And then thirdly, he says this, I'm also a fellow partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. And he's been building up thoughts about this glory throughout the letter. He's been talking about how a reward awaits the faithful. And I think this idea is going to come back throughout the next few verses. So just keep that in mind. So he says, I'm a fellow elder. I'm speaking from experience. I've witnessed the sufferings of Jesus. I'm also a fellow partaker in the glory that will one day be revealed. So listen to me. And he gives them the same command that Jesus gave him, all the way back in John chapter 21, verse 16. He says, shepherd the flock. In other words, he's taking Jesus' command and he's passing it along to these elders. And he gives them, he doesn't just tell them to shepherd the flock, he gives them an example of what that looks like. He gives them three pairs of both negative and positive exhortation here. And what I mean by negative is he says, don't do this, and then positive, he says, do this. So he has three pairs of these exhortations. The first one, he says, you're doing this not out of compulsion, but willingly. In other words, an elder can't just be forced to be an elder. They have to have the will to do the job. They have to be willing to take on the responsibility. Social pressures and other such things should not be a substitute for the pure motivation to do God's will. I think that's very important. And the second thing he says is, once again about motive, he says, they're not doing this out of for shameful gain, but willingly. He says they're not supposed to be doing this because they have some kind of greedy plan where they can grab money or power or anything like that. They're not doing it for these evil motives. They're doing it for pure motives. And that's what these first two pairings of exhortations are all about. It's all about motive. An elder needs to be motivated from the right place if they're going to take on that pastoral position. But then in the third pairing, he actually gives examples of what it looks like. How does it look? What does it look like when an elder leads from this place of humility, from this place of willingness and love for the Lord rather than compulsion, rather than greed? Well, he says it looks like this. They're not domineering. They're not making the people under them cower in fear. They're not leading with an iron fist. It's not a dictatorship. He says they're not doing that. Instead, they're leading as examples. They're not leading from behind with whips saying, move it, people. They're not doing that. They're leading from the front. They're examples for the rest of the flock. This is the way it ought to be. And in verse 4, he tells them, if you do this, if you go about this awesome responsibility through this humble means, he says, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. An amazing promise to anyone who would be a leader, an elder in the church. But I want us to notice something. I want us to notice when that unfading crown of glory comes. When does he say it comes? When the chief, I hear some of you, when does he say it will come? When the chief shepherd appears. And I think when is important. This is going to be a point he's going to emphasize in the next several verses. In other words, he's basically saying to them, be humble now. Don't go after glory now. Don't go after any kind. Don't try to put yourself above other people and seek glory for yourselves in the here and now. He says, be humble now, and God will give you glory later. Key word on later. That glory will come when the chief shepherd appears. Don't waste time in the here and now trying to seek glory for yourself. Instead, God will bring you glory. He'll sort it all out. And I think that's important, and it'll come back. And I think we can all agree that it's important for leaders to be humble. It's important for elders. It's important for any leader of any capacity. If you have responsibilities, if you have people who are depending on you, it's important that you be on your knees, that you be humble. The more power, the more privilege you have, then the more responsibilities you must have. Now imagine you're in the first century church for a moment, and you're listening to this letter read aloud. And this letter is, let's just say you've been waiting for the letter of Peter to come because you've got a few issues going on in your church. And there's some issues going on with the leadership dynamics. I've seen it firsthand in my own life. It wasn't necessarily too severe, but I have witnessed a church and a situation where there were a group of young people in the church who were looking very negatively upon the eldership. They thought, oh, they're out of touch, they're making decisions that we don't like. And there was a time in my life that I got to witness some real anger and strife being directed at the eldership in a church I was a part of. And so imagine you're in a situation like that. And you've got Peter's letter being read aloud to you. And Peter is saying to the elders, don't domineer, do this out of pure motives. And you're thinking to yourself, yeah, Peter, good point. And you're tempted to look over and you're hearing that, elder? Say, Rod, do you hear that? You're tempted to just nod along and say, that's right. You guys listening? You taking notes? But then Peter, he turns it on them. Look at verse 5. He says, likewise, you who are younger. Some versions might say younger men. It could be that there were younger men in the church who were trying to take some kind of power, or there's any number of situations that could have happened, but it seems there was some kind of issue going on where he says, likewise, you younger men, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So Peter has given this charge to the elders, and then he says, but younger people, you need to be subject to the elders also. And then he makes this blanket statement for everyone. He says, everyone needs to clothe themselves with humility. Everyone. No matter where they stand in the pecking order, no matter how much perceived power or authority they have, no matter how many responsibilities or how many people depend on them, everyone in the church is expected to be humble. Everyone. So I go back to my original point of, there's certain jobs, there's certain moments where we need to be on our knees. Well, that list should be expanded. Because in reality, you need to be humble wherever you are. You need to be humble in whatever situation you're in. Whether you're performing the, quote, menial tasks in the church, or whether you're in a leadership position and you have people depending on you for all sorts of things. Everyone needs to be humble. Everyone is supposed to clothe themselves with humility. And then he brings up the reward again. Verse 6. It says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. At the proper time. I really think he's basically saying, in the here and now, stop fighting over power, stop fighting over authority, stop fighting over glory. All of that belongs to God. In the here and now, everyone be humble. Perform your role humbly, and God will hand the glory out, so to speak, when the time comes. When Jesus comes back, when the chief shepherd returns, he will give us the glory, and there will be plenty to go around. Because we're going to be sharing in his glory. We don't need to be striving after things that don't matter, or really that belong rightly to God and to Christ. In fact, I want us to notice what Peter's doing here in all of his references back to Jesus. First of all, he calls Jesus the chief shepherd, which I think is in a sense putting the shepherds, the pastors, the elders into their place by saying, yeah, you're supposed to shepherd the flock. However, there's only one chief shepherd. And I think that's the basis for why an elder should be humble. Because no matter what kind of authority they have in any given congregation, we're all subject to Jesus. Jesus is our master, and he is the head of the church. There's no one person that's the head of the church. Jesus is the head of the church. In fact, I think that's the basis for why everyone should be humble in the church. There's a sense in which Jesus being the head evens the playing field for all of us. Yes, there's different types of authority. Yes, there are leadership roles. But we're all subject to Jesus, and everyone underneath is a slave of Christ. This is basically what Paul does when he writes his letter to Philemon. It's an amazing short letter we have in the New Testament where Paul is actually writing to a literal slave master. And he's sending an escaped slave back to Philemon, to this slave master. And there's a lot of debate among scholars as to what exactly Paul is asking. You could certainly argue that Paul is asking Philemon to set Onesimus free. I think that's certainly a viable argument. He's at the very least wanting Philemon to look at Onesimus, this slave, as a fellow human being. And one of the things Paul does in that letter, it's really cool, is he will constantly refer to Jesus as Lord or Master, the same term that a slave would use when referring to his human master. And he keeps referring to himself and to everyone else as slaves. What's he doing there? He's pointing out that even though this Philemon had some kind of perceived authority in the Roman Empire, he's saying in the church, in the kingdom of God, there's one slave master, and everyone else is his slaves. That's Jesus. He is Lord and Master. Everyone else is even underneath. So there really is this sense in which Jesus being the head of the church evens the playing field. However, Jesus goes even further than that. If that weren't enough to make sure everyone's humble in the church, Jesus takes it a step farther. And this, I believe, is what Peter refers to when he uses the term in verse 5, clothe yourselves in humility. Another translation might be gird yourself. It's this idea of wrapping your robe up tight, tying it around your waist so that you're able to move about. And it's the same terminology used of Jesus in John chapter 13, verses 3 through 11. When Jesus was in the upper room with his disciples, and Peter remembers this moment well, after the meal, Jesus takes off his outer garment and wraps a towel around his waist, and it's the same term. He girds himself. He puts himself into the position of being a slave. And what does he do? He begins washing their feet. And this is something slaves would do. How does Peter respond in that moment? Peter says, "No, you're not going to wash my feet." Because Peter understands the pecking order. He understands that Jesus is the leader and that they are the followers. Jesus has no business washing their feet in his mind. And of course, Jesus says, if you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part with me. And Peter then allows him. He says, okay, wash my whole body then. And I love Peter. I love his enthusiasm. But Peter in that moment, he didn't understand what Jesus was doing. He couldn't understand why the rabbi, the master, why the Son of God, why the Messiah, why God in the flesh would make himself like a slave and make himself lower than his own followers. But here we are years later, and he's writing this letter, and he uses this term. And I think, at the very least, Peter understands a little bit better. At the very least, he understands that Jesus was acting as a perfect example for us. In other words, if it wasn't enough motivation for us that we all should be humble, if it wasn't enough that Jesus is Lord and we're all under him, Jesus then flips things upside down and says, now I'm going to serve you. Therefore, we have absolutely no excuse to expect to be served, to have any kind of power grabs in the church, to go after any kind of glory for ourselves, we have zero excuse because our Lord and Master was willing to put all that aside and to become as a slave. And therefore, we all need to be willing to do the same thing. We need to be willing to roll up our own sleeves. That might be the modern equivalent to girding our robes. We need to all be willing to roll up our own sleeves and be willing to do the dirty jobs, be willing to serve other people, willing to do the, quote, menial tasks without complaint, without searching for glory or recognition. We need to be looking for ways in which we can be helpful for one another, that we can serve and help those within the body and those even outside the body, those in the world. This also means we're not complainers. We're not constantly seeking our own way and complaining anytime we don't get it. Instead, we are humbly searching for ways in which we can be servants like Jesus. That's what it means to be clothed in humility. Now, I know there are many people, many brothers and sisters in our brotherhood here who humbly seek out these, quote, menial jobs, these jobs that don't garner praise. And they do so not looking for recognition, they do so out of a pure willingness and love. And my hope is that each and every one of us can follow in their example, and especially in the footsteps of Jesus himself. That we would all be willing to put any attempt for glory, any attempt for praise or recognition aside, and let Jesus sort that out later when he comes back. Because that reward will come for all of us who have been serving the Lord. That reward will come, but it's God's to hand out. It's not ours. So I hope that let me offer that as a final word for us all, that we would all clothe ourselves with humility, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He will reward and lift us up at the proper time. It's not our place to lift ourselves up. The lesson is yours. If you're here this morning and perhaps you've been struggling with selfishness or with pride or arrogance or any number of things that we've just talked about, and the invitation is for you. You can come forward. We can pray with you as a congregation. We can help you. Or if you're here this morning and you've not yet given your life over to Christ, you've not submitted yourself to his lordship, I ask, why do you delay? Please come as together we stand and sing.